A game that was once the preeminent rivalry in women's college basketball is back on the docket for this upcoming season. Tennessee will host UConn in Kim Caldwell's first season as the Lady Vols coach. We will discuss whether Tennessee will be ready for that game, whether it has the roster, update the transfer situation, and more on this edition of the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinel's Cora Hall and John Adams. We got the news last week. Well, it's been a little bit over a week now that Geno Auriemma, UConn's coach, came up to Cora Hall at an event in Knoxville and said, got some news to share. UConn's coming to Tennessee this season. Cora, tell us how it went down, because this was kind of an interesting news development. Normally, these series are announced by media relations department. Anymore, it seems like schools love to post these on X, on Twitter. But that's not how it went down for you, right, Cora? Geno just dropped some news about a week and a half ago on you.
Yeah, I wanted to introduce myself to him at the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame induction ceremony because obviously I've been in press conferences of his, and he ended up being at my USVWA brunch when I won an award because he was there for a different writer. But I've never actually spoken to him face to face, and I was like, I feel like I should just introduce myself, put a name to a face. And we were just kind of chatting. He was like, oh, well, we're coming to Knoxville next year. And I was like, oh, really? That's interesting. He goes, yeah. Because I was like, I wasn't sure if it was happening, new coach. But he was like, yeah, we're coming to Knoxville. So it's back.
It's back, and it's going to be a multi-year series. We don't know exactly all the terms of it, but this year they're coming to Knoxville. The date has not been announced, but this is not presumed to be a one-off. There will be a return trip from Tennessee. Connecticut media has reported that return trip will happen. So we don't know how many games it will be, but the series is back after a 1-year hiatus. I wrote a column about this last week. I think the return of this rivalry is good for the programs. It's good for the sport. It was, once the premier rivalry in the sport. It's been a while since that's been the case. They went 13 years without playing each other. Tennessee fans know those reasons with Maya Moore and the rivalry between Pat Summitt and Geno. But from my perspective, even a dialed down rivalry is better than no rivalry at all, I think. And in this moment where women's basketball is sort of hitting a crescendo, to me, it just feels right that the game that was once sort of driving the sport, and certainly the two programs that were driving the sport, are now playing again, even if they're not what they once were. UConn being closer to what it once was than Tennessee, but neither is at that pinnacle. I still think that this is a good game that should be played every year. But what are your guys' perspectives on that, John? Let's start with you, because you've covered some of these games over the years, back in the day. What do you think about this rivalry coming back? What it means to women's basketball in this moment, and whether this is something that Tennessee should be interested in pursuing long term?
Yeah, I think it should. And I don't know where these programs are headed. I don't know how much longer Geno will coach. That's one of the few columns I've ever written critical of Pat Summitt, was when she canceled this series. I understood why she did it, but thinking big picture, I thought both programs, win or lose in a particular year, both programs really benefited from each other. And I think both programs made each other better. It was just kind of like you were watching the growth of women's basketball, but through a narrow lens, because there weren't many other teams that fit into that picture. It was Tennessee and UConn, almost as though they had a monopoly. So anybody that's followed women's basketball for the last 30 years can relate to that. There just aren't that many rivalries that can compare. I can't think of any. There have been other good rivalries, but because of all the national championships, the programs have won 19 combined, 11 UConn, 8 Tennessee. And I know it's kind of outdated now, but it's still UConn versus Tennessee. And I still think the programs could benefit from playing. I think there will be interest in the game. And now that we maybe have more fans of women's basketball, thanks to Caitlin Clark, maybe more people will watch this game. So I'm glad they're doing it. I hope they keep doing it.
Cora, is this rivalry still needed, still relevant? What do you think?
I think there's kind of like, I don't know. You can say that it's not relevant anymore in a way, and I think that's true, but I also think in some ways it could be a tool to remember the history of the game. Like John said, with there's so many new fans, like women's basketball is exploding, and that's amazing. But I think something I've noticed kind of over the end of last season, maybe, is how little people know about the history of women's basketball, or just isn't accessible because of the historic lack of coverage, or people just don't feel like putting in the time to actually learn like how this game came to be, and maybe it's not important to them. So I think having a rivalry like Tennessee and UConn, while it may not be incredibly relevant in its current stages, I think is cool to maybe use it to make sure people understand the history of the game, of a kind of yearly reminder like, hey, you might be new here, but you should learn more about Tennessee versus UConn because it took the game to a whole nother level even 25 years ago. Before, like, the last record I'm pretty sure for like a championship game viewership record, I'm pretty sure it was Tennessee and UConn when it was still on CBS before it went to ESPN for like 30 years. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, why is nobody watching? And then they put it back on ABC, and the last 2 years it's gone from like 8.9 million to 18.8 million. So I think it's super important to have fans understand that like this is not new. Like, women's basketball actually used to be really popular when Tennessee and UConn were huge rivals, and the game kind of exploded because of what Geno and Pat did for the game. And they're still the two schools with by far and away more national championships than anybody else. So I think it's cool in that way, even though it's not necessarily like super relevant. And even though UConn is like still at the top of the game, and Tennessee's trying to rebuild a few times now already. But Geno, I think we don't know how much longer he's going to coach, but I do remember he had told one of the UConn writers he was working on a new contract. So he could be around for a little while longer, but I think it'd be cool in that aspect to teach new fans the history of the game.
Yeah, I mean, getting two blue bloods together like this, I will always be in favor for. And it was interesting when this rivalry renewed after the 13-year hiatus, renewed in January 2020. I went to Hartford and covered that game before the world shut down a couple months later. And it was interesting in the build up to that game, we heard from Geno, we heard from Kelly Harper, both sort of downplaying the return of the rivalry, like, yeah, this is great, but it's not going to be what it once was. And being in the building that night, like, yeah, maybe it wasn't what it once was. Certainly it wasn't, but it didn't feel like just any other game either. And the Lady Vols were competitive throughout the first half of that game. It sort of became kind of a preview of what was to come in the Kelly Harper era, sort of the competitive for about 25, 30 minutes and then fade at the end and lose the game. But yeah, the energy in the building that night, again, it wasn't the pinnacle of the rivalry, but I didn't buy either sort of the pregame talk that that this wasn't that big a deal anymore. And even afterwards, Geno admitted, yeah, it's not what it was, but maybe this still can be something. And obviously, at least on some level, these programs feel that way because they're getting it back on the schedule for this year. But looking at this upcoming game, now, again, the date hasn't been announced, but we know it'll be in Knoxville. We know it's Kim Caldwell's first season. She's got a roster in transition, has added a few transfers. Geno coming off of another Final Four, and he's got Paige Beckers coming back. I don't know if UConn is necessarily the team to beat this season, but they're on the short list of teams to beat. So I guess is Tennessee ready for this? I mean, yeah, we can say like, yeah, it's great that they're playing, but in terms of the game itself, are they built for this matchup this season, or is this a little bit too much to chew, do you think, in Kim Caldwell's first season?
Well, I think, Blake, I guess the short answer is no. I think UConn coming to Tennessee would certainly get the crowd going. I think people will come just out of sentimental reasons, if nothing else. They learned a long time ago to hate UConn and hate Geno, so that will bring out some fans. But we look at UConn, the program has dropped off because it was winning national championships every year. And you can only sustain that so long. And it's not South Carolina now, but it still made the Final Four. It's not as though it's fallen off the basketball map. And I think this is a big if because UConn's had so many injured players in recent years, the prominent players. I think this could be Geno's best team in a while, maybe since he won a national title. A lot of really good guards. And I don't think Tennessee's built for that to handle a team of that. Just when I look at if you look at those two rosters, I don't think a lot of people on Tennessee's roster could start for Geno at UConn. Do you, Cora?
Yeah, so it's going to be nearly impossible for Tennessee to beat UConn next season, and y'all can print it out and put it on your poster board or whatever. But
bulletin board material
yeah,
coming here.
literally. I mean, take it. That's fine. I'll own up to it if I'm wrong. I promise. But I mean, Kim Caldwell, it depends also on the timing of this, right? We don't know if it's going to be a November game, a late December game right before conference play starts. But Kim Caldwell said, I can't remember which press conference, but she said November is not her good month and that, that's when the team's still coming together. And so if it's in November, it might be just watch this game to watch UConn type game. Because I think when you do compare the rosters, I mean, UConn's got elite 5-star players out of high school up and down that roster. And most of them should be healthy. I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons they have quote unquote fallen off from that national championship run is because of the recent stretch of injuries that is just maybe the worst I've ever seen. Obviously had to fact check that, but they've had so many star players go down or significant role players go down. So I think if everyone stays healthy, that's one of the best rosters in the country, top to bottom. And it has bona fide stars like Paige Beckers, AZ Fudd, with Sarah Strong in the next number one recruit in the 2024 class is going to UConn. So I think it's a lot. It's a lot for a system like Caldwell's to overcome when there is so much talent on the other side. Defensively, it's going to be really hard to stop that team because Geno's teams are very disciplined. They execute very well, and I'm sure they will work on breaking a press before they come to Knoxville. So yeah, I think that's a really tough matchup in her first season just because at the end of the day, you can execute your system as well as you want to, but when the other team has so much more talent, period, compared to your team, it's very hard to overcome that.
Yeah, it feels like one of those matchups, maybe not unlike that 2020 game, where could be competitive early, particularly if the crowd gets into it. You ride the energy of the moment, and you're feeling pretty good about yourself maybe midway through the second quarter, and then you look up midway through the third quarter, and the game's over for all intents and purposes. So let's step back for a moment and look at this big picture, though, moving beyond this UConn-Tennessee game that will be on the schedule this year in the coming back of that series. John, you wrote a column recently at knoxnews.com I thought was interesting, looking at this through the lens of the NCAA tournament, because we all know the history of the Lady Vols, haven't missed the NCAA tournament. There's been a few years where they've been bubble teams, maybe middle of the season. It's been, are they going to make it? Are they not? They get in the end. But you looked at the realities of this year and some of the challenges on the schedule and also the challenges on the roster that Kim Caldwell inherits and is trying to improve and build a little bit through the transfer portal here. How realistic do you think it is that for the first time in the program's history, Lady Vols could miss the NCAA tournament, and how big of a deal do you think would that be to Kim Caldwell's tenure?
Well, I think it's a very real possibility when I look at that roster, and I don't know how good these transfers will be. I mean, they aren't elite transfers. They aren't top of the line people that were in the portal. We've seen other better programs attract better players from the portal. Tennessee wasn't able to do that, but I think by bringing in players whom she obviously believes fit her system, that's important. So I see that as an upgrade. I feel better about the team than if it had added no transfers. I would have said there's absolutely no way it's making the NCAA tournament. I'm not saying it will, but I think if it doesn't, it's more of a testament to the program that Kelly Harper built than the one that for which Kim Caldwell is trying to lay a foundation for. Uh, this is not really her roster. She's bringing in transfers. I just think it's going to be very difficult. And a factor in this as well is the SEC might be as good as it's been, and I don't know when, maybe ever, because of the fact you have South Carolina is the program in women's basketball. LSU won a national title in 2023. Uh, it's going to be a title contender. It added 3 transfers. Texas has got a ready-made Final Four contender, gets its best player back. She was injured last year, added a big-time transfer. Oklahoma added a great transfer from Oregon State, has most of its nucleus returning. So right now, I just mentioned 4 teams. Tennessee's not going to be competitive against those teams. I don't think. I mean, you could catch them on the worst day and maybe lose by 10 points, but I just don't see Tennessee being competitive against those teams. And then you look at other areas at other teams that like Alabama and Mississippi State, teams like that. Kentucky's going to be
a lot
better
better.
with Kentucky bringing in not only a Virginia Tech coach but an All-American point guard. So I don't think I've ever seen the SEC this deep where ESPN bracketologist Charlie Crean would look at it and say, put 11 teams in the bracket. May not turn out that way, but still that's a testament to how good and how balanced the league could be. Not just good at the top, but down through the midsection into the bottom half. And so you're looking, where can Tennessee get out and say, okay, we can win this game, we'll win that game? I think when you look at the schedule, when it's finally assembled, I think it will be hard to say games that you can point to and say, oh, the Lady Vols will win that.
Yeah, you make
not going to be many games like
you
that.
make a good point, John, with the roster Kim Caldwell inherited, and we see this everywhere. Like if a coach struggles in year one, you can sort of lean on that narrative of, well, that's a byproduct of the team that was inherited, and we know, one reason why Kelly Harper was not retained after this season wasn't doing enough in the high school recruiting efforts to keep her job. Not only was it on court situation, but also staring into the future of that program. But Cora, what do you think? Is Caldwell doing enough in terms of bringing in these transfers? We know she's brought in 3 to make this team kind of a year one contender for the tournament.
I just also want to bring up that Auburn brought in some really good transfers, and they were really good last year to me. And I've thought for a few years now that Johnny Harris, her teams were very close to being good. And I think next year they might surprise some people. Maybe not if you've been paying attention, and also Vanderbilt is bringing in a 5-star freshman, and they got the really good Penn State guard who Tennessee was also going after, I believe, who's very good defensively, fits in Shea Ralph's system really well. So those are 2 other teams that I think Tennessee could struggle against, especially with how strong defensively they both are. And I remember when last season Charlie Cream first dropped Lady Vols out of the field when they lost to Middle Tennessee. And I chatted with him. I was like, just like gauging where we are on the panic scale. Like, is it like for real? Like, should you panic, or is it kind of like, meh, they'll be fine? And what he said was they will be fine as long as they rip off a bunch of wins in SEC play. Like, usually the SEC gets like 6, 7, 8 teams in. So as long as you're like solidly in the top 6, you should be fine. That gets getting a lot harder this year because Texas and Oklahoma, like John outlined, are very good. And I genuinely wouldn't be surprised if they were like top 4 teams in the SEC next year. It definitely depends on how Oklahoma can adjust to SEC play. I think Texas is fine. I think Texas is built for SEC play the way that they play under Vic, and that makes sense because he used to coach at Mississippi State. But I mean, if you just go down the line, like, you could see Tennessee finishing like 8th in the conference. I don't know. And it also depends on like, well, I guess Vanderbilt's their home and home. I don't remember if they're doing another home and home in SEC play now that there's more, if it's just one-offs, but that also factors in, I guess. I think my answer to your transfers question is it depends, because she didn't bring in, established star players like Kelly Harper did, right? Kelly Harper did really well in the portal. That was kind of like the one recruiting thing. They did really, really well to supplement what they needed. But I mean, these are players who didn't average double figures last year. I think Samara Spencer did, but Samara Spencer is a guard who didn't shoot real well from 3 last year, which is, and she's coming from a system where she took a lot of threes, and I think she shot like 26%. So I feel like Kim Caldwell could have used a really, really good shooter to add to, what she already has. And who knows, maybe next year Samara Spencer will shoot like 40% from the field. We'll see. But I think, with her system, maybe she doesn't need those stars, right? Because at Marshall last year, there were a lot of players averaging 18 or more minutes, or I think there's 12 averaging 11 or more in the rotation. So I think maybe you don't need the star player of the portal who's averaging, 15 to 20 points a game. Maybe that wasn't what she was going for. Not completely sure. So I think it just depends on like, does the system truly work at this level? I think that will kind of answer, did she do enough of the transfer portal or not? Because they could have gotten, there was definitely better transfers out there, but maybe, the ones that they got will be who they need and it'll work out. But I think it just kind of depends.
It's interesting. Corey mentioned like, well, they might finish 8th in the conference, and then as I'm adding up all these teams we've been rattling off here that are going to be pretty strong, I'm thinking like they might do well to finish 10th in the conference in Kim Caldwell's first season, and that leaves you, even if the SEC is getting a bulk of teams into the tournament, that leaves you on precarious footing, and that leaves your record in a bit of a scenario as well, right? Like, I mean, so many factors are considered with NCAA tournament admission, but if you're taking a beating and your record's hovering down there around 500, it can be hard to make a case no matter how strong your conference is. So, but right now it seems like Kim Caldwell's still in this honeymoon phase, right? Like, I mean, the energy of the hire seems pretty good. I mean, there's always going to be some folks on the fence about it. I think there are certainly some fans who wish Kelly Harper had gotten another season, right? I mean, there's different camps here, but overall, there's a pretty good buzz around the hire, particularly with Kim Caldwell sort of working the stump at these Big Orange Caravan events like we've seen. Now that, honeymoons end when the season actually starts. But John, how have you kind of gauged the reaction here? We're about a month into this since Caldwell's hire. And at first, as you wrote in a column for Knox News, you thought the hire was a joke. And you're like, wait, what, really? They're hiring Kim Caldwell? But then you warmed up to the idea in the aftermath of the hire, and it seems like the fan base has as well. So how do you gauge sort of this first month on the job and just and kind of the reception of Kim Caldwell in Knoxville?
Well, I think in a way, Danny White set her up pretty well in that the Big Orange Caravan came along at the right time. I think she's young. She's different. She has a different system. She delivered a great introductory press conference speech, I thought. It was just terrific. And so I think she can rally the fan base. So I think interest is high. And when you have one of those press conferences, that's kind of what you're trying to do. You want people to get behind the hire. Now, based on my emails, there's still people angry that Kelly was fired, but I don't think those people are saying, "Okay, we hate Kim Caldwell now and hope she fails miserably." If things don't go well, though, those fans will say, "Well, you never should have hired Kelly Harper," even though Kelly Harper is to blame for the roster that Caldwell's taking over. The one problem I had with the press conference was to talk about championships. Where we're in an unusual situation there at that gathering because you're firing a coach who's been to the Sweet 16. It's an NCAA tournament program. You go to the Sweet 16, you win 20 something games. It's not as though you're firing a coach who's just at a program that just had a losing record. So if you're going to, Danny White's talking about Pat Summitt's legacy and you want to play that, you want to honor that. So you want to keep going up. So you want more than Sweet 16. And so Danny White talked about winning championships. Kim Caldwell talked about winning championships. That's a really good rallying cry, but it also raises the pressure, I think, when you go into next season, when people say, "What, we can't even make the NCAA tournament," and you're talking about championships. So I just think that might add even more of a more difficulty to what already could be a troubling first season for her. Because if you come in and the program's at a low ebb and you've had a losing season and your team goes out and wins half its games, you can say, well, that's progress. Nobody's thinking about a tournament. But with this program, with the track record, I think there are a lot of fans that believe Lady Vols, no matter who's on the team, what the depth chart looks like, who the coach is, they take the floor. Well, they're in the NCAA tournament. They win 20 games. They're about to enter a different world.
Cora, let's wrap up with this. I want to get your thoughts on what John was discussing there, but also want to wrap up with your thoughts. We talked about these three transfers that Tennessee has gotten: one from Syracuse, one from Miami, one from Arkansas. Do you see there being maybe like a remaining? I'm sure there's a lot of needs, right? But a remaining need that can be realistically addressed, because it's not as if you get to wave a magic wand and produce a Paige Beckers on your roster. The portal doesn't work that way. You take from what's there and who you can get. So do you see something that maybe Tennessee can realistically address to improve themselves, before the season?
Yeah, I'll start with what John was talking about. I think regardless even of what they said at the press conference, or if you're going to talk about championships right away or not, I think when Danny White fired Kelly Harper, I think that immediately set these expectations already. And I think that immediately sent the message that this job is somewhat of a pressure cooker. So I think the actions speak louder than words in this case, because I know that was a lot of the immediate reaction when Kelly was fired was, well, like, I thought it was all right. I didn't think it was that bad. Or, we just went to back-to-back Sweet 16s. Like, what more do they want right now, so soon, in 5 seasons, when the first season was ended by COVID and the second year was shortened by COVID, and how do these recruiting limitations, like, what exactly are you expecting in this new era of women's basketball, right? Like, you have basically 5 seasons to get to a Final Four. That's going to, coaches notice that. Like, there were probably people who turned down the job who were like, yeah, I don't really want to get fired after like 5 seasons if I don't make the Final Four, because every coach knows how hard it is to make a Final Four. So I think regardless of what they said, how they said it, the expectations were set like once he fired Kelly. in regards to the transfers, if they could get anything else, I mean, they have 3 scholarships open. So I think with this kind of system, the more depth, the better. Like if she could get to 15, I know there's not a whole lot left, that is it worth bringing this person in maybe? I think if she could get one, at least one more guard who can just really shoot the leather off the ball from deep, 2 preferably. But I think if you get one more player who can just really shoot the ball, or a point guard who can, adapt to your system pretty quickly and know what you need, because I think, I don't know, it's so unique because usually you think of a point guard like, hey, they're gonna be on the court for like 35 minutes a game, but that's like not really how this system works. I think the highest minutes per game on Marshall last season was 28, and then 26, and then like 24, and it really dropped off after that. So I think they could use more depth with a point guard. I think they could really use another guard in the perimeter who is just a great one-on-one defender, because Tennessee's weakness last season was its defense, like without a question. And the SEC is only getting faster. The guards are only getting better. So I think if you can get someone on the perimeter who is like long, athletic, who's just a really great defender to complement, you have Talaysia Cooper, who's an amazing defender. Someone to really spearhead that press for you with her, I think. I mean, there's like someone like Kaya Wynn could do that, but also Kaya Wynn doesn't score as much. So I don't know what her role is going to look like next year. So yeah, I think if you can get another guard who's just a great one-on-one defender with a lot of speed, and maybe another guard who can really, really shoot it, then I think you'll be good.
All right, the honeymoon phase remains underway for Kim Caldwell. She's a month into the job, wrapping up the Big Orange Caravan. The honeymoon's nice, but the challenge will be real in year 1. You can find all the coverage about her first month on the job over at knoxnews.com. Cora's got coverage of the transfer additions and the Lady Vols activity in the portal. You can also find updates on the developments with this UConn series as well. And thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.